Hello, governors, and welcome back to another episode of Power Squared. Today's episode, Charles and I are going to be talking about making the case for premium licensing in Power Apps. This is going to be quite a contentious subject, I think, isn't it, Charles? Any opening thoughts on that?
Yeah, you've already got someone arguing with you.
Yeah, that's my watch. It didn't like me.
Oh, it's your watch.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love this topic because there's just so much to it. And I also love it because I've been the developer in that position where I've wanted to have premium and not been able to have it, and been looking for the way to convince someone, like, please just invest in Power Apps premium licenses. It's worth it. But I couldn't quite articulate it back then. And I think the story was really different a few years ago. But today, there's just so much more to Power Apps premium licensing. Microsoft are constantly throwing new features there. So yeah, where do we start this story?
I wonder if it's a good kind of starting point to kind of discuss some of the common scenarios as to where kind of a lot of organizations in our experience have kind of started from, and where that kind of case for premium starts to kind of bubble up from. Because there's a few ways, isn't there? You kind of see it across different organizations and different kind of industry verticals where you kind of start to see that case for premium becoming more and more important and prominent as things develop and organizations mature with Power Platform. I think if I could start on that one of the things that I found is a lot of organizations will always start from that kind of seeded M365 license aspect. And SharePoint is such a common scenario in the kind of industry that, most places start here. They'll start building solutions and, they'll be SharePoint backed, and they'll just kind of run with the horses effectively and get going. But there's a lot that isn't considered at that point. Like there's no kind of analysis on what value it's bringing. There'll be loads of kind of stumbling blocks due to them not having premium licensing. And very quickly that argument starts to build. Is there any other kind of examples that you can give, Charles, around kind of where it kind of stems from?
What I would like to do is talk about the SharePoint side first, actually, because I have a lot of experience with having SharePoint issues where I've been wanting to use Dataverse, or I've seen it with clients. And let's go through a couple of those examples, reasons why they would want to do that. So a very simple one is that they've built their app, they've got SharePoint as a backend, and then they want to deploy it. And in order to deploy it, they need to spin up another SharePoint site or SharePoint list because they don't want to use their development one, hopefully. Or even worse than that, they decide to use the same SharePoint site and list in development and production, which I've seen before as well.
Just use the same one list across dev, test, and prod, and it's horrible, isn't it?
Yeah, it's terrible. It's dangerous.
Yeah.
So yeah, wanting to deploy that app through the channels is tricky when you've got SharePoint involved like that. Of course, it's still doable, but from a business maker perspective, the last thing you want to do is give them those hurdles to jump over. So another one when they're building their app is they will come across limitations that only exist for SharePoint and do not exist for Dataverse. So a very simple and obvious one is when you're wanting to search data. So you can't use the search function if you're using SharePoint as your data source. You have to use starts with. And that's a terrible user experience because it's very common for a user to want to be able to search within a term, not to have to search from the beginning of whatever that term is. And then the other one that I'm going to mention is delegation. You get so many more delegable functions within a Power App than you do within SharePoint. And when you're making an app and you have SharePoint as your backend, you'll very often hit upon that point where if only I was building this in Dataverse, I could use that function. Now I can't. Now I have to find a workaround, and I'm creating this technical debt, and I know that it's painful.
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? And I think one thing that I always kind of think about as well is if you're stuck on the standard licensing, you don't have access to all the tools either. So something as simple as building a really straightforward data-driven application experience on premium is dead easy because you can just use a model-driven app. Very straightforward to build and get started. You can build one of these in mere minutes, really. And if you don't have that, you're probably building a Canvas app, which is fine, right? We all have Canvas apps. But there's a lot of technical overheads involved in building a Canvas app. They're not so straightforward to build. They're easy to get started with, but they're difficult to master. So that's another really kind of interesting point. And yeah, you're right. We don't have access to all these kind of premium data sources or the connectors that really kind of take this to the next level. So when we're starting to think about that strategy, where should we begin?
I wanted to talk more on that point with the model-driven apps, because I think that's a really, really good point. Not just the model-driven apps, but looking at the data. So with Dataverse nowadays, you can spin up an entity relationship diagram, which maps out all of your database for you. Not only that, but you can talk to Copilot and get it to generate fake data for you. So you can instantly see what your app looks and feels like with some data in it. Doing that side of things within SharePoint is nigh on impossible. Yeah, so I think that's just such a good point. And we haven't even touched on the security aspect, which is massive. Within Dataverse, you can use security roles, and you have this granular control over your security. When it comes to SharePoint, you have to be extremely careful about how you're allocating access to it. And then you have to reflect that access in your Canvas app. It's not going to just inherit it like a model-driven app would with security roles. So yeah, there's so much to it within that developer experience. But yeah, sorry, your question.
Yeah, I think just before we move on from that, the developer experience, I think you can already, if you can't tell already, you're going to have such a nicer developer experience. And there's a lot more tools available to kind of enable developers at all levels, be them, makers or professional developers, to kind of bring solutions together with premium licensing versus standard. So lots of ways there. But yeah, my question was around kind of starting to build that case for premium. Where should, let's say, I'm an IT manager, or I'm the custodian of Power Platform in the organization. I realize the benefits that this brings to my developers, but I now need to kind of translate that to the business. Where do I start?
Yeah, that can be a very difficult conversation to have, because Power Apps Premium is not cheap, although I do feel like you get a lot of value for the license. And that does change over time. Like we talked about the fact that we're getting so many more new features with managed environments, and extra developer features is coming in to do with artificial intelligence. Like if you're using Dataverse, you've got prompt columns as something that you can use. And there's just so much extra stuff that you can play around with. But making that case can be tricky. And it partly depends on whether you're making that case for a new project that you want to embark on, or whether you're saying that we've got all of these projects sitting here using, say, SharePoint as their data source. We would like to convert them to Dataverse, because we can see a number of benefits for that. And I think one of the really important things to consider with the existing projects is that those benefits are not just for the developers, but those benefits will trickle through to the users. So if, for example, with the search function, users are struggling to search properly because they're having to use the beginning of a term, you move over to Dataverse, they can use the full term, they can do wildcard searches and everything. So you get that additional functionality. Also, as you mentioned with model-driven apps, maybe there's an app that's been built that's a Canvas app, but makes way more sense to be a model-driven app. So as you know, building in things like filtering, sorting, searching, of course, all those different bits where you manipulate data, you get that by default in a model-driven app. Whereas in a Canvas app, it's very tricky to build. And there are always problems somewhere with that side of things if you're trying to replicate what a model-driven app does. But if you could just move that app into being a model-driven app, it's not going to take you very long, most likely. And then the benefits for the users will be huge. So it's difficult to calculate, but ultimately you can see from that vision that you're going to be saving time with developers, and you're going to be saving time with users, and everyone's going to have a better experience. And we're not even yet talking about the governance side of things that's so much easier because of that. So that begins to make that case towards whoever you need to make it to. But businesses or organizations speak in terms of money, don't they? So really, you want to be able to put something in front of someone to say, if you spend X, you are going to save X. And that's ultimately where you want to get to. And that is quite a tricky thing to figure out. Do you have any ideas about how we could build those figures?
I think there's a few things to consider there alongside that. So I think in terms of building up that kind of monetary kind of value kind of business case, it's understanding that if you're going in building a solution, how much time is that saving users when they go through this process versus maybe a legacy process? If there was a lengthy, process that involved paper trails and emails, it's taking, a user on average, X number of minutes to do. And by automating that, it's going to save even more. That probably covers your licensing if they're doing that multiple times a month right off the bat. So right there, you've built up a solid case. But then you've got to multiply that by the fact that if you're going for something like a Power Apps premium license, said user actually has access to access as many premium apps as they want. The kind of snowball effect starts to happen when you kind of add that up across multiple processes. So very quickly, it starts to become cost effective, the kind of more that you invest in terms of developing and building in the Power kind of platform. The other aspect I wanted to kind of touch on here as well is, particularly in kind of the larger kind of organization and enterprise, a lot of the time you're not starting with a solution that is Dataverse driven. You're maybe starting with a legacy system or data that is in another data store, something like maybe like SQL or something very bespoke. The integration capabilities that Premium offers is far and above beyond what standard licensing will give you, even down to something so simple like API calls. You're very limited on the standard license, but the Premium gives you a lot more flexibility in that. And you'll find a lot of the kind of enterprise-led organizations that are building these solutions are integrating into these data stores. They're needing access to this data. They're needing to retrieve it and actually, display the data or manipulate the data in these Power Platform solutions. So, when you start to expand out there and say, well, actually, we're using SQL Server, but we can actually bring and build solutions using our SQL data a lot more quickly than doing something in the kind of pro dev space and bringing this fusion development concept together. You're starting to build an even stronger case when you start to add in the value as well. Would you agree?
I love that. Yeah. So if you're thinking about an enterprise level organization, they're using these existing software systems that aren't Microsoft hosted, most likely. And however they're getting the data from those will vary. Maybe they're able to get a download of a spreadsheet and then they're having to manipulate that spreadsheet by hand and then send it to another team member who does something with it. It's that kind of archaic process. But what you're talking about is that maybe they could have a custom connector or something like that or even just bring the data into Dataverse where suddenly it's available to that team with low-code tools and they can do whatever they want with it, which means that they can then, instead of manipulating it by hand in Excel, they could bring it through a Power Automate flow to manipulate it to then send it off, or they could bring the data into Dataverse, have it in a Power App to then manipulate. They could just make everything so much easier. And what they need to do for that is have a Power Apps premium license or a Power Automate premium license. It makes so much sense. And if you can phrase that to then the person who's holding those purse strings, then I think maybe they could start to see the value of it. And you're not, like, as you said, you're not just giving them access to that data through that particular piece of software that you're using, but you're also opening up all of Power Platform suddenly to be used because you can build as many apps as you want, as many flows as you want within the context of the app. Or if it's Power Automate Premium, as many flows as you want. And then you suddenly just got so much you can do.
That is so awesome, isn't it? When you think about that, when you kind of sit back and think about what that gives you, that's great. I think just kind of leads us on nicely, right? With all this premium licensing talk and the benefits it brings, with great power comes great responsibility, right? And that leads us on to probably another great benefit of premium. And that's the governance capabilities, because making this data available to end users, it sounds great in principle, but I can guarantee you that your data team is going to have a heart attack when you say to them that you've made this data available to end users. And governance is there to help. Premium gives you access to enhanced governance features, right? Do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've touched on managed environments before, but we haven't really gone into detail about them. But it's the managed capabilities that you get with Premium. So let's say that you've got you're giving your makers, the non-IT people in your organization, the ability to use Power Apps, to use Power Automate. When they go to access it, they're going to get thrown into your default environment. If you don't stop them, they're just going to be building everything in there. And they can start to build some chaos, and it can be difficult to maintain and difficult to deal with what they're doing within that one environment. But if you have Power Apps Premium, you can use environment routing, which means that instead of them all getting sent into a default environment where they can cause chaos, they will be then routed through into their own developer environment. So everyone gets their own environment. You don't have to pay for the capacity in that environment. Microsoft absorbed that. And it means that they can then build things with some freedom in isolation. They can play around with things. And then when they're ready to actually give it to someone, then it can go to another environment, which brings us on to another premium feature, which is Power Platform Pipelines, which is again, only premium. And it means that they can then take whatever solution that they've built in their developer environment, and at the click of a button, they can then deploy it into another environment, that new environment can be locked down in a different way. So it means that in their developer environment, they are a system administrator, they have quite a lot of power, but when it's deployed into this other environment, this production environment, it can be quite locked down so that they can't mess around with things. Maybe they aren't even allowed to see the data. You can make that happen. So they could build an app where they're not allowed to see the end data. And that can happen quite a lot, where you don't want them to be able to see everything, but you do want them to be able to build that process. So much power with just that simple side of things. And there's more. Tell us.
Yeah, it's fantastic, isn't it? I think one of the things is it's giving, that governance side, providing those guardrails, particularly for makers that are, maybe low-code developers, haven't maybe done, or traditional developers, but also gives that more assurance as well for your Fusion devs or your pro devs who work in that kind of space day to day, so that you know that nothing's going to go wrong where it shouldn't. So that's really good. And I guess that's the other aspect, or the other side to this as well, is we've got the kind of pro dev integration, the building, the kind of value there. But there is that kind of flip side, isn't there, on that kind of maker or that kind of citizen developer kind of side, which is actually you're providing your organization with a set of productivity tools if you go for premium. We're all so used to having Word, Excel, PowerPoint now that it just is second nature. Going with premium almost provides Power Apps, Power Automate as an additional kind of tool set for users to just jump into and start doing things to increase their productivity. And that in itself is quite difficult to measure, I would argue, that the value that brings. But if you're building a solution, or a maker's building something for personal productivity, and they're saving 2 or 3 hours a day on something because they've automated it, well, they've now got 2 or 3 hours a day that they can do other things. That value is insane when you think about it, isn't it? So when you start to talk about that journey, there's so many different angles and how you can make that case. And it's just kind of trying to frame it in a way that you can kind of realize the benefit from both sides of the kind of fence effectively, from that kind of your kind of enterprise-led kind of solutions, the pro dev side, but also that productivity maker side, which is maybe something, solutions that aren't business critical, but they're increasing productivity on a daily basis, right?
And if you're wanting to understand the value that you get from a solution, well, because Power Platform's a low-code tool, it means you can build something quickly. You can build a proof of concept and you can see, does this give me the results that I'm expecting it to give me? And the difference between premium and standard in that is stark. Because in standard, you have to build it yourself as a Canvas app with Power Automate flows. Whereas in premium, you get Plan Designer. And for those who don't know, with Plan Designer, you speak to it in natural language, and then it uses multiple agents who will go off and perform different processes for you. And those processes would be things like it would build out user stories for you. It would build out your entity relationship diagram, so your database, and it would build out the concepts for all the different tools it thinks that you should have. So it believes you should have a Canvas app for this, a model-driven app for this, maybe an agent, maybe a Power Pages website. It's very complex and it's getting better all the time. And so what it means is that for a business maker, what they can do is they can just write out their business case, or they can even just upload a Word document that contains their business process. And then this will go off and do the work for it, and it will build a proof of concept. So that's at the click of a button, and you maybe wait 5-10 minutes for it, maybe do some adjustments. You might spend a few hours working on it, but you then have this proof of concept that you can then see, well, am I getting the value that I was expecting to get? Whereas if you're in standard to build that same thing, you're talking about days worth of work or weeks potentially.
I think the concept fail fast is something I quite like, and having premium allows people to kind of try out these ideas with quick proof of concepts. And, the majority of the time, these don't go anywhere. They're not useful. They're not great. But, that odd occasion, you find something great that you can then build and expand upon. And having Plan Designer as part of your premium licensing is fantastic for that. So a worthwhile investment in of itself. And I think if our kind of viewers haven't kind of got the gist already, I'm sure they kind of are now, is that there's a lot here. There's a lot to kind of understand, think about. And if you're a one-man band, or, you've got a very small team trying to look after this, even with just everything we've mentioned, you'll struggle to do this day to day, by yourself. So this case for premium doesn't always stay with just the licensing. It could be around kind of expanding the team as well, I think, because having a stronger team that specializes in these areas so that you can divide and conquer is ultimately going to provide a more successful kind of return of investment on this technology. Is there anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I agree with that. And of course, the other side to it is risk. As someone who's in charge of the finances, you're always assessing risk. And you want to assess not just the fact that if you invest money, you want to get money back from it, or you want to make a saving, or you want to improve your business. But you also want to think that if you don't invest this money, what's the risk of that? So if you don't invest in premium, you don't get all of the managed features, the managed environments and the managed governance features, but you also are missing out on things like the security side of things that you get with with premium features. And it's much more difficult to reduce the risk to your organization if you don't have all of those capabilities. So it means that you're then opening up your organization to more risk if you don't invest in premium. So that is an unfortunate side of things. And in an ideal world, you wouldn't have to pay to be more secure. But the way that things stand at the moment is you really do pay to be more secure within Power Platform.
And again, it's clever marketing, really, isn't it? But, we knew that was always going to happen. We never had this previously, a couple of years ago, and we do now, pay more and you'll get more effectively. And that's just the way things are going. But you get so many cool features by going for premium. And I guess, to kind of look back to that kind of expanding the team scenario as well, and kind of some options that are maybe available when you start thinking about that, because, justifying who you need and why is also part of that discussion when trying to kind of come up with the approach. And I think in my mind, there's two kind of main kind of ways to approach it. You've got the fact that if you're the custodian of the platform, you'll want to build a team around that kind of function. So you become a bit more of an enablement team. So your team's there supporting delivery in terms of, being able to help with that pipeline aspect we've talked about, securing the platform, ensuring standards are kind of adhered to, that kind of thing. So you're more of a kind of hub for enablement, ensuring that the technology is used in the correct way and governed in accordance with the organization, versus the other approach, which is more of a kind of delivery team where you'll have maybe team members that are actually going out, actually delivering these solutions on behalf of, your team, based on kind of what's required. So what's your thoughts on that kind of approach, Charles? Have you got any others that you think, or what would you say to that?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And the other side, of course, is that if you're operating with a small team, you'll be conducting a lot of manual processes, and you won't have time to then create automations for those processes. So there'll be things that will get missed, things that you can't keep a track of. it'll be much more difficult to keep your tenant clean and clear and tidy. Whereas if you have a larger team, you can invest some of the development time into automations, which will mean that you can automatically respond to your makers. It will mean that you can monitor things more efficiently and you can identify risks more quickly. And then also potentially automate protecting yourself against those risks. So having a bigger team definitely has a big impact across the board. And I think enablement is something that's really important in that side of things. So if you don't have the team size for it, you're essentially just leaving your makers to their own devices, hoping that they discover Power Platform or hear about it. And maybe you have the time to do a monthly newsletter or something like that. But you're not giving them what they need in order to more quickly grow within the platform and build things. Whereas if you have some people dedicated to enablement, you can have training sessions, you can have support sessions, you can collate training documentation from Microsoft Learn, so you can build up your own collection of things that people should go through. There's so much more that you can do from an enablement side, but you can only do those things if you have the people available for it.
Yeah, I think as well, when we're talking about building these teams out, one of the things that maybe is a bit daunting is, providing all that resource from the get-go. It might be challenging to kind of justify that. But, these teams, I would say, particularly in Power Platform side, and when we talk about enablement and delivery, they're a lot more agile than maybe traditional teams. So you can scale them up and down quite readily. And you don't necessarily have to hire permanent employees for all of this stuff. I think, having a balance of a permanent employee mix and contractors or a partner involved, I think that's a really good balance to have, because then you're leaning on expertise from, industry leaders versus just trying to figure it all out yourself. So you can kind of scale this the right way, but you don't have to kind of struggle through it yourself. So that's something to consider as well when we're talking about teams and people, is you don't have to build this all from scratch yourself. You're probably better off starting with a mix of permanent and partner resource, probably.
Yeah, and you can also use freelancers, of course.
Of course, yeah.
If you don't have the budget to go for the contractor level, maybe you want someone who's just potentially available for support as and when you need it. You could do it that way. But also, if you're starting out on your Power Platform journey, then you're not going to have many apps and flows, and you're not going to need as much management around them. And then you'll build up progressively or potentially exponentially. What I have seen so far is that organizations, when they start utilizing Power Platform and they agree that it's their platform of choice, they end up basically just doubling apps and flows every year in terms of the count of them, even with cleanup processes. And it grows and grows and grows. And so then all you want to do really is flex your team size according to how many people you've got building and how many things they're building. So if you only have a few things being built, you don't need much governance around that because it's easy to keep control of it. But when you get to the point of having hundreds or thousands of apps and flows, you can't track everything. So you need some processes and you need help with that kind of thing.
Yeah. And I would argue as well is that the team doesn't have to be a purely Power Platform based team, because there's a lot of functions here, particularly when we talk around the kind of larger end of the kind of scale, where things aren't necessarily just Power Platform. I mean, we talked about kind of application lifecycle management of Power Platform pipelines. But if you're an enterprise or a large organization, you're typically using something like GitHub Actions or Azure DevOps for this. So, DevOps engineer usually is in the mix there somewhere, as well as release management. These functions don't necessarily need to know the ins and out of Power Platform. They just need to understand how that affects their world. And then you've got things like project managers and business analysts. All these types don't necessarily need to understand Power Platform in its entirety, but they can bring in their expertise to really kind of prop that team up and make it excel. So it's a really interesting kind of mix that you can have when you start thinking about it. One of the things I wanted to kind of move on to, we've mentioned it a couple of times now, and that's enablement, because enablement is such a big kind of piece of the puzzle when it comes to getting a return of investment on your premium investment. Because when you think about it, you're you're licensing all of these users, but if they don't know how to use the technology, it's largely pointless in my mind. Okay, they might have to use an app or two or something like that, but the real value comes in when they're actually building as well. So this enablement side becomes really important, and having some sort of center of enablement or some sort of plan for how you can kind of start helping your users use the technology in its fullest. What are some options when it comes to that?
It's a really, really big topic. And my personal opinion is that it's all well and good for people to play around with these tools. And yes, they can build something quickly. But if you don't want to have too much technical debt, and if you want to build something properly, you need someone experienced to be by your side. And how to get that experienced person depends on the organization. Do you bring in a Microsoft partner and get them to work with you on a project and then you learn from them? Or do you trawl the internet and try and find best practices on Power Platform, find some white papers and things like that, and learn that way? That's going to be a lot more time consuming. Or do you bring in a company who do training? Potentially, but what I would be careful of with companies that purely focus on training is that if they're not building solutions, they might not be aware of the nuances. They might just be telling you the fundamentals, and they might not be telling you every time you're going to build something, you create a solution as your first thing. Everything goes into a solution. But a lot of the time, like with an app in a day type thing, they're not necessarily going to tell you that. They're going to say, look, this is how you create an app. But if you just create an app, how do you move that app anywhere? Well, it needs to be in a solution. So I think best practices are so important, and you have to get that from someone experienced.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that's a really good kind of viewpoint. The challenge might be is how do you, if you've got lots of makers, how do you kind of almost like buddy up with an expert on every single one, particularly in that kind of maybe personal or team productivity? And that's, I guess, what probably we're getting at a little bit here is starting to build a community up a little bit in an organization. Because if you have champions that can help with this stuff, or you've got some sort of forum or area where you can ask questions, you can validate your approaches and stuff, it becomes really, really important, I think.
Yeah. So I don't know if it might be too much for this video because of what we've covered so far. But there's a lot that I have to say on the enablement side. Thinking about the maker's journey into Power Platform, they might be coming from the perspective of not being technical at all. They know how to use Excel. That's all they know. Excel and emails and Word. And they don't know more than that. And how do they find out about Power Platform? And then also, what does their experience look like onboarding into Power Platform? Like they go to Power Apps, and then do they get a welcome message because you've got premium and you can do the maker welcome message? That's nice. But then also thinking about things like having a community hub. So like a SharePoint site where they can go to and they can see training material. They can view the best practices on there. They can look at previous community calls that you've had within the organization. Also, ideally, some training videos or training material of some kind that's bespoke to your organization. This is how we want you to build. We want you to build in your developer environment, start off with the solution, create your components in a solution, or maybe start off with Plan Designer. Who knows? It depends on the organization. And then when you're ready to actually use something, this is what we want you to do. So use pipelines or however they're going to do it. So all of that stuff is really important.
Yeah, definitely agreed. I think going back to that kind of like having an expert by your side kind of concept, I think if you set up your kind of Power Platform Center of Excellence team, or your team as a kind of enablement function, you can probably kind of tackle that quite well as well, in that if you've got some sort of gates when it comes to that kind of deployment process, it almost allows you to verify these solutions before they go to the target environment. Not everything's going to go to the one environment. We've talked about environment strategies and routing, and this is where it all starts to become a reality. We start to think, well, actually, if this is going into the finance production environment, there's going to have to be some really stringent, strict kind of governance in place to ensure that that's what's being deployed meets all the criteria for going into that environment, versus actually this solution here is going into a maker environment or a team productivity environment. that doesn't actually need all of those kind of strict controls. It just needs to get the job done. It still allows you to have that element of kind of oversight, but not trigger a rigorous review, for example. So you start to balance the kind of, I guess, what would the word be? The doorways or the gates that would maybe prevent a solution from being developed and deployed super quick versus actually we need to just take our time a little bit here, make sure we've ticked everything off and we're doing everything in the right approach and the right way.
We definitely need a video on that side of things, don't we? So thinking about assessing something before building it, for example, is one thing. And then also when it's been built, do you really want to deploy that? How are you going to analyze it and make sure that you're happy with it being deployed? Maybe there's a massive security flaw. So is that project important enough to go through a security assessment? Or are you dealing with sensitive data? Does it need to go through a GDPR audit? There are levels to things, aren't there? Maybe it's just a tiny app where you're not doing much with it, so it's fine. You're not sharing it with anyone. It's just for you to consume yourself, and that can go through no problem. You don't need any check on it whatsoever. So yeah, we need a video on the levels of that side of things. Another thing that you brought to mind for me is that because these are potentially non-technical people building things, they might not use the right tool for the job. So they might be using a screwdriver as a hammer. So it might be that they are, or yeah, everything is a hammer, right? If everything is a nail, if you have a hammer, it's that quote, isn't it? So they see Canvas apps and they're like, oh, Canvas apps are amazing. Everything has to be a Canvas app. But maybe what they're building would make sense as a SharePoint customized form, or maybe a Microsoft form that saves into SharePoint. And maybe they don't need Power Apps whatsoever. And so, again, going back to that assessment period before you build something, it would be nice to have some way of determining, should you build this in the first place? And also, are you deciding on the right tools to build this? And that, again, goes back to the enablement piece of, wouldn't it be nice if you could say to people, should I do it this way? And you have someone who will respond to you to say, actually, there's a better way.
100% agree on that. And I think, we are kind of moving into enablement as a topic here, and definitely we look to bring a dedicated video on enablement in the future. But I guess what we're trying to kind of say here is that this enablement piece becomes a lot more simpler with premium licensing. And all of these tools are not always, actual technological tools like, your Power Apps, but all of these processes that link into this become a lot easier to deal with when you've got a premium license, because you can use the technology to aid that process. And you just mentioned there, and that kind of review or that assessment kind of period, and a lot of organizations will have maybe like a change advisory board or some sort of design assurance board, something like of the nature that would meet maybe once a week or once every other week with designs. And then there'd be a quorum of people from different business areas discussing that to ensure that, we're not repeating standard processes. We're not, repeating technology. We're assuring the correct kind of approach is taken, that kind of thing. So, there's more to it than just saying, here's your premium license, off you go. You've got to build your kind of fortress a little bit and actually start to think about how you can divide that responsibility, build the process, and ensure that the kind of organization adopts those processes. And that becomes the way that everyone has to go, or it doesn't happen at all. And that can be a real kind of teething issue, I find, when it comes to organizations, is how do you kind of assure adoption of the technology in the right way versus just everyone's got licensing, off you go to the races, and it just becomes a massive governance nightmare.
Going back to the premium side of things with Power Platform pipelines, it means that the maker, once they've built something, they have a way to just click on something to deploy it. So you're keeping it really easy for them. But then you within your governance team, you can actually hook into that pipeline deployment, and you can have an approval step in there. So you can actually, in that approval step, you can check whether you're happy for it to be deployed. You could do that in a manual fashion or an automated fashion. You can do it so many different ways. And then you decide whether it gets deployed or not. And then it either does or doesn't. But you can only do that if you have premium licensing, because Power Platform pipelines only work that way. And if you don't have those, then how on earth do you get the maker's solution into that following environment. What can you do? There's nothing that's simple that's available.
Yeah, I think something that kind of resonates with me as we've been talking about this isn't a quick process when it comes to unlocking premium licensing with an organization. There's so much to consider, but you've got to start somewhere. And, you need to start kind of coming up with almost like a checklist and ensuring that you've kind of covered all elements of that checklist. What value are the solutions bringing? What's the time savings? What's the governance benefits? How can I realize those benefits and build out an actual kind of team around all of that kind of governance and enablement? There's so much to consider, but it's not a sprint when it comes to this. You're not very rarely have I seen in my experience organizations that just kind of go hell to leather and say everyone has a premium license, off you go, sort everything out retrospectively. There are organizations that have done that, and that's great because they've kind of overcome the hardest hurdle, which is actually getting the license. But a lot of the time it's more kind of little bits at a time. You're building department by department, and you just have to kind of make sure that you're always aligned as you kind of move up until everyone has that license. But having that checklist, ensuring everything is kind of squared away as much as possible will be of massive benefit, and actually ensuring that you can get as much premium licensing as you can.
Sounds great. Sign us up.
Yeah.
I think from this perspective, it would be amazing to know in the comments what your licensing situation is. What percentage of your organization is licensed? How do you deal with it? Have you struggled to get additional premium licensing? Also, I'm curious, has this video helped you to get more licensing available within your organization? Or has it maybe made something change in your mind where you've realized that actually we need premium licensing? This is a no-brainer. Because ultimately, when you weigh everything up, it does become a no-brainer, but it does depend also on, is it a no-brainer for X number of percentage of people within your organization, or is it for everyone? Because there are organizations of differing sizes. If you're an organization with 300,000 people in it, or more than 300,000, like the company I work for, if you give all of those 350,000 people premium licenses, then that's an insane amount of money. You can't really do that. So how do you then decide to start building that journey? So yeah, very interesting.
So much food for thought, and yeah, it's really interesting to hear what our viewers are at, where you're at with this kind of journey. So do let us know.